everyone wants our government to be effective, and particularly the agencies that are responsible for our national security.
Yeah.
Then why is reform in this area so difficult?
Well, reform is always difficult, but reform in this area is particularly difficult, in part because reform usually happens because of public pressure, because of media and public scrutiny, and outside advocacy. And it is nearly impossible for that to happen unless you have whistleblowers who come forward. So you have this sort of flurry of interest in reform post-Snowden. We're now seeing the Congress coming to a close, and I don't know that anything will have happened. And by the new Congress, I think we'll possibly be back to people sort of being comfortable with the status quo again. So there's sort of this moment after there's a public release of information where you can really get reform. But other than that, it's so hard to get reform.
One of the things that POGO does, again, to create more transparency is they have a database of cases that have shown waste, fraud, and abuse. Can you talk about the database?
We actually were shocked to discover that the government actually didn't keep track of its contractors in terms of cases of misconduct. So contracting officers across the federal government, when they wanted to get a sense of whether they should give a contract to company X, they didn't have easy access to what was the history of that company in its other contracts. And so we started this database in part for federal contractor, government employees who were making those decisions. Since then, the Congress actually passed a law requiring the government to replicate our database, but they're still very, very minimalistic in what they include in their database. But we have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of cases and of misconduct by federal contractors, rather. And what's disheartening is it rarely seems to have an impact on the big contractors getting more contracts.
So you would think that if a company had been caught defrauding the government, that they would not be allowed to get future contracts.
You would think that.
But that's not the case?
That is not the case, and it's particularly not the case in the national security world. The argument that the agencies make is, well, we're so dependent on them because they're the only people who can make this airframe or this ship or whatever the case may be. But that is, of course, also the government's own fault because in, I guess it was the 80s, there was this flurry of consolidation in this industry, and we were testifying strongly against it for exactly this reason. So as a result, we have few companies that have real monopolistic control over the government.
What reforms would you recommend?
I think the most important reforms are to extend genuine whistleblower protections to intelligence agency employees so that they can ultimately get to the courts, as well as certainly contractors. I think that would make an enormous difference